World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus and a New Year's edition of our World Affairs Roundup. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Today, we'll be examining 4 factors sure to play a role in the global arena in 2008, including paranoia on the Potomac. Critics at home and abroad charge that fear has been the organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy since 9/11. Will 2008 be the year Uncle Sam gets his groove back? Revenge of the realists. With a hoped-for democratic tsunami yet to materialize, stability is again topping many policymakers' agendas. Has the Bush administration's push for global political reform been overtaken by events? Oily warning. As oil hits $100 per barrel, analysts warn the global energy landscape may be headed for a seismic shift. Is this a serious crisis or just a crude joke? The incredible shrinking dollar. As the dollar continues its slide, nervous investors are eyeing alternative currencies. What will be the fallout on Main Street if the greenback loses its place in the global economy? To help us understand how these issues will define the headlines in the months ahead, we're joined by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as communications and program director for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, Happy New Year to you all, and welcome
to you.
Welcome to the first International Focus of 2008. And I want to start with this first story about the degree to which U.S. foreign policy really has become this sort of self-sealing sort of philosophy based on fear that drives its own internal logic, and we're forced to take certain actions like the invasion in Iraq and others. Fareed Zakaria, Zbigniew Brzezinski came out with articles to this effect. And I suppose I want to ask you all, what's your sense, or how do you determine what is a serious threat and what's hysteria? And maybe we'll start with you.
I agree with you, and I agree with the writers about the force of fear that we're feeling, starting particularly with 9/11. And I think it's tied to something larger than 9/11, actually, which is the loss of some of our power in the world, in the sense of the rise of China, the loss of some of the stories that we're going to talk about later, the loss of control over the international monetary system with the fall of the dollar, high oil prices. So there are a lot of factors that add to the fear of terrorism. So I think there's a general fear around, and it's not just of terrorism, but it's of losing who we are. And I think that it's hard. It's hard for a leader to come in. The campaign that we've just been in has been, most of the candidates have been campaigning on using this politics of fear. And I think it's going to take real leadership. Now back to your question as to how do we determine what is a real threat and what is not. I think, it's hard. It's obviously hard. We didn't see 9/11 coming. But I think that this is a case where we have to work with our allies. We have to talk about where the threats are. We can't work in a vacuum and let this paranoia, we can't, I think one of the authors said, let this genie out of the bottle where it takes on a life of its own. Right. So there has to be a lot of talk.
Well, John, Ann talks about the need for sort of leadership if we're going to move beyond this, but so far people have been reluctant to do that. Do you think we'll get that leadership, or how difficult would it be?
It's going to be very difficult, because which of these leaders is likely to put themselves out and say we're changing course? Look what happened to Kerry in the last election when he talked about 9/11 being just another event, which I believe is true. I mean, we've now gotten far enough away from it we can get some perspective on terms of what 9/11 meant. But I think Ann was onto something in terms of this being much more than terrorism. This has, in addition to what she said, it also is the globalization process, where we have lost, nation states are losing control over the ability to be able to influence the way in which markets are moving. How do they influence groups like Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders, who don't report to any organization, are unaccountable to anyone, and just go off and do largely what they want to do?
So, Robert, have we become captives of this post 9/11 mindset now?
Well, politically speaking, yes, because the original motivation was political power. It helped re-elect President Bush, that he was able to use the war on terror, and it also became an organizing principle that replaced communism, which we didn't have after the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so if you look at the presidential primaries right now, on one side, the Republican side, they're falling over each other trying to see who can have more gruesome 9/11 images on their advertising. And John McCain, for example, who may now be the front runner, ran an ad very critical of Mitt Romney, saying that foreign policy experience was not the top credential for a presidential candidate. On the other side, the Democrats are very afraid of taking on the issue. So the paradigm of terror, if you will, is still dominating American politics and seems like it's going to for the foreseeable future. That being said, it's very hard, therefore, to have a realistic, I don't know about realism, but a realistic assessment of threats, because anyone who isn't sufficiently strong, just like the worst days of the early Cold War, is soft on terror and therefore is a threat to the United States of America. I think Ann's right and John's right, though. There's this underlying kind of anxiety. There's a lot of polling about global energy in the United States that shows that Americans fear greatly that we're a second-rate country, we're behind Europe and other countries, but the reaction to that is not to try to, is to reassert our power. And the main way we can do that is by going out in the world and being a first-rate superpower again and fighting our enemies, which is now this loosely knit group of terrorists. But I think terrorism is it's not an enemy, it's a tactic. It's a military tactic. So it's a completely false premise, I think John and Ann would agree, for a foreign policy in the first place.
So, I mean, maybe the question that all the presidential candidates should be asking you all is, so if it's hard to, as you were saying, John, just to sort of say, we're not going to do this anymore, because you open yourself up to lots of vulnerability there. You can't do that without a compelling sort of vision of what we do that's different. So, well, what is that?
Well, we don't have a strategy. We have not come up. What is defined by the administration as our strategy is the war on terrorism, and I agree that this is not a way in which, this is a technique that you have to deal with. This is a technique that someone uses against you, but it's not a strategy to which you can counter. I mean, there's no goal in mind. Terrorism is going to be there forever. It's always been there in the past. Also, in terms of the fear, this is playing out in the rest of the world as well. The rest of the world is also fearful. They're fearful of one superpower which wants to throw its weight around. No one likes the fact that there is only one superpower. There is a containment policy of sorts which is occurring almost naturally amongst the rest of the world to try and offset U.S. power.
So what is that? If we've got anybody listening in from one of the campaigns, what's that? I still don't have the. What's the compelling vision for
I don't have it yet.
The non-war on terror or the?
Well, there still needs. There was an idea of a post-Cold War foreign policy or post-realist foreign policy in the early 90s, and it didn't come to full fruition, and it was replaced by the war on terror. There needs to be a balanced foreign policy that's realistic, but also advances America's fundamental principles that we really do strongly believe in, and then you can have both, I think. So someone needs to have the courage to articulate that kind of a foreign policy.
Well, so you gave us a perfect segue into this realism, as realism returned. U.S. foreign policy, and President Bush has made lots of statements about fostering democratic values and democracy around the world, and now especially with the recent events in Pakistan, people are saying, that's out. Realism now says we can cozy up to dictators. We shouldn't pretend to be supporting democracy if what we're really after is stability and security in the world. So, and I know, John, this has been a horse you've ridden a lot around the balance between idealism and realism in U.S. foreign policy. So maybe could you talk a little bit about that distinction and how you think we're making that balance? And are we making the right balance now?
Okay. First of all, there's a foreign policy dictum that there needs to be a balance between idealism and realism in foreign affairs. Now, what is realism? Realism often is defined as pragmatism, doing the reasonable thing at a particular time. It often is short-sighted, but in the case of the containment policy, which was a highly realistic policy, it lasted for 50 years. Idealism are the basic tenets, the principles upon which a country is based. Now, as a global power, we often run into problems because our interests are so widely spaced that what's logical and important to us, our vital interests in a particular region, will mean that we trump some of those value issues, and that plays back badly when it's applied to another part of the world where we don't have or have few vital interests. So there are complications that go with it. Who are the idealists and who are the realists in terms of presidential? I would say idealists are logically or most demonstrably Wilson. Jimmy Carter was an idealist. George W. Bush is an idealist, or he became one after 9/11. Before that, I don't think he was. If anything, he was a realist, and he probably wasn't even that.
Mm-hmm. So where are we now? I mean, is this a different shift, say, in our foreign policy?
I know that people say that George W. Bush became a realist, and certainly he did start, talk about pursuing democracy and pursued democracy in various places around the world. Certainly the whole administration wasn't behind it. There were a lot of people who were fighting it tooth and nail along the way. So we didn't present a united front on that. And I think that we also presented a very hypocritical front in the sense that we pursued democracy when the results were the ones that we liked, and when the results were not what we liked, as when Hamas won, for example, we didn't look as if we were so pro-democratic. So I think that there are Americans who think that we've abandoned realist principles, but around the world we look very much like realists, especially when you look at our lack of respect for human rights, and the whole issue of torture and everything that's come out. We don't look much like idealists. So I think that we, to a certain extent, have been pursuing the negative side of realism, which is that might makes right, and you need to just look out after number one yourself. And hopefully we will return to a realism that is more pragmatic and more in our own interests, actually. I know I'm sounding like it's a bit paradox, but it's...
Well, but this is interesting, though. I mean, so it's a sense you're saying, and maybe Robert asked if where you would come out on this, in a sense, sort of a very short-term pragmatic approach, if that's realism, hasn't really left, or at least to the outside world. We've never been on the idealist side.
I don't think so.
How do you see that then? Have we had a real idealist strain in our foreign policy in the last 8 years?
Well, of course, when you call something realism, you've already won the word battle, right? You framed it as, oh, this is real and other things are unreal, right? I mean, realism was a doctrine that dominated American foreign policy after World War II and probably well into the 90s, if not later. And it said that the fundamental element of foreign policy and international relations was that nations are motivated by interests defined as power, and that other considerations like ethical considerations were extraneous. That wasn't what really motivated nations at all. Now, realism can't explain anything like the foreign policy of George W. Bush, for example. It can't very much explain some of the rogue actors like that we're concerned about and that are propagating terrorism, for example. So going back to that sort of orthodox doctrine not only gives us a very limited kind of almost cynical view of what's possible, such as creating democracy, it also doesn't necessarily explain reality better. Realists led us into the Vietnam War, for example, and realists treated the Soviet Union as an imperialist power when it was a status quo power for generations. So I think we need a balance. There's a place for power and interest in foreign policy, and there's a place for trying to make a realistic assessment of what is the motivation of nations. But there's also a place for some sort of human aspiration for creating a more just society, a more democratic world, and a world that's environmentally sustainable. And so that a post-Cold War foreign policy would really be one that balanced realism with the other human motivations and aspirations.
Great. Well, we'll come back. We're going to take a break, but we're going to come back to another very real problem, which is the rising price of oil. We'll be back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-222-4636 229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and a special edition of our World Affairs Roundup, and we're looking at the stories behind the stories, trends that are going to affect issues that arise in the year ahead. And I know others of you may still want to get back onto the realism, idealism question, and I can be a little lenient on that one, but I do want to move us into talking about oil, which is, we talked earlier about getting back to this realism, idealism thing.
Realism.
Is the politics of fear, guarding what are some of the real threats. And some are saying that the surge in oil prices, which have almost, I think, more than doubled in the last year, as being one of those real threats. And so I suppose the question for you all is, let's put that in perspective. Is this a threat that we should be concerned about and having policy geared to that to be dominating our policy as opposed to, say, the war on terrorism? John, I'll go to you.
I'll start with, according to the people that I know who understand the science of this whole thing, there is a finite amount of crude available in the world. There may be other discoveries, but they will never reach the point where oil will be as plentiful as it was. Secondly, and as important, the rest of the world is beginning to use oil at a pace that approximates our own. The industrialized, we were in some ways, when all those industrial jobs went abroad, so did the need for oil go with them. And so that increases the amount of demand in the world. That presents us with a real conundrum. We don't have a particularly forward-looking energy policy. We haven't had a forward-looking energy policy because politicians are only elected for 2 to 6 years, and that's the time frame in which they define what they need to do. And we need something that looks beyond that to where the next kind of energy is coming from.
Robert, is this a real, a part of a different paradigm of dealing sensibly with issues like oil?
Well, we're going to have an energy crisis. It's a question of when. Fossil fuels they're limited. And we have a very backward-looking energy policy, so there's a huge opportunity here. If we were to invest in renewable energies, like in an Apollo kind of project approach or Manhattan Project approach, we could create a huge number of jobs, and we'd also reduce our dependence upon the Middle East, which is one of the biggest fault lines in international global relations. But as it is, we've allowed it to get to a crisis point, whether this oil run-up is the real oil run-up, or whether some people think it's speculators moving it up and it's going to recede for a while and then happens in a couple of years. It's still going to happen. And we could have $4 a gallon gas by April, a lot of analysts believe. And so this is something we need to get our hands around. If we're defensive about it, then we not only can have a United States and global recession, we also could have more foreign policy mistakes in the Middle East and elsewhere as a result. So but hopefully it's something that will actually cause us to get our act together. The problem now is that politicians now pay lip service to it because of global warming, but no one proposes anything bold to really get us off dependence on fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. And the oil, again, just as it's been hard to say we're on terrorism, we want to move away from that, it's been hard for anybody to really say we're going to take the pain that we're required to move away from dependence on oil. So. Mm-hmm. How do you see that issue playing out in the next election?
Well, one of the good things about the price of oil being as high as it is that it makes it then financially viable to pursue these other alternative forms of energy. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Whereas when oil was selling at 20 or even $50 a barrel, it didn't make much sense to pursue some of these other forms. So I see it as an opportunity as well to, it hurts people in the pocketbook. It definitely hurts us not just in gas lines, but in all other areas of the economy. But hopefully, politicians will do something bold. I was looking at the figures showing that in real terms, discounting for inflation, that the price of gas and all is the same today as it was in that we're really in the same situation today as we were in 1973 in terms of the price of a barrel and gallon of gas. But 1973 seemed so much more dire to me. I mean, I remember that we all really pulled together and tried to do something about it. And I don't get that sense here. And now we even have global warming on top of it, which we weren't facing at that time. I mean, obviously we were, but we didn't know it. And so nobody expresses the urgency that's necessary. So in a way, maybe the $100 is a good thing.
Both Anne and Robert spoke about two different approaches to dealing with the crisis. One is the Manhattan approach, where government goes in. The other is the price of oil goes up to a point where it becomes feasible to do other things. And I saw the government approach back in the 70s under Jimmy Carter, where they threw an enormous amount of money at the Department of Energy and out into the field with very little effect. I'm, as a conservative, more willing to see the market and prices define what's going to be feasible.
Well, I want to move into another issue which is very much related to this, and others would feel perhaps this is a true existential threat to the United States, which is the falling value of the dollar against the European currencies, even against the Canadian dollar, and not that alone that's a serious issue, but that it sort of has all these spillover effects where people now are not using or talking about not using dollars to trade in oil. Perhaps the one that surprised me the most was the Taj Mahal in India. Indian tourist resorts are not going to take the dollar now, which is sort of a little bit of cold water. So, Robert, maybe I'll start with you about. So, is this a true threat?
It reflects part of a larger threat. I mean, it always is spurred in part by our balance of trade deficit, by the subprime mortgage debacle, which is going to be deeper and deeper than the S&L scandal, it certainly appears. And so it's part of a great economic dislocation where we have kept the economy perking along in this country, but it's being built on sand, quite frankly. And so and this is an indication of that. I mean, and if a lot of countries are going to sell off their dollars, then I don't know, things could spin out of control as far as having a deep recession in this country, which could cause a global recession. Now, this brings us back to the other topics. How foreign policy is based on a paradigm of fear, and if it's partly because of our lack of confidence, if we have a very deep recession, even a near depression right now, then it has tremendous foreign policy implications. But I think it seems like Humpty Dumpty is coming apart, and that it's a question of when the wheels fall off.
A little bit overstated. I mean, a declining dollar raises possibilities as well for export. Now, this would be all wonderful if we weren't dealing with, as Larry Summers very nicely put it for us, we've been financing consumption rather than investment, which is a very critical issue. And we've been doing it increasingly through loans rather than through equity. So there's an overhang out there. And I think we were talking earlier, I was talking with Doug about this, that I remember back when we had the dollar overhang in Europe back in the 60s and 70s, and everyone was afraid about what was going to happen. It didn't happen, but right now this is just one more dimension of this, I guess fear is a good issue. I don't want to overstate it in terms of our ability to deal with it.
So, how do you see this threat? The dollar is connected to so many other issues that when we've talked about some of them. So how do you weigh this development with the dollar?
I think that because the dollar has been the international currency, and because so many countries have pegged their currencies to the dollar, it's not like any other currency. I mean, obviously it stands alone. And so many other countries also don't want to see the dollar fall because they're too invested in the dollar as well. And I think the most important thing here is it's worrying. It does make us feel, in a way, I think it makes us feel a little bit like a third world country. I mean, when we see, oh, here's where people come for cheap labor and here's where people come to shop, because we've got the cheap goods, it really gives an odd mentality. But I think that the idea that we need to go back to some kind of, I always turn to some kind of multilateralism, but some kind of G7 arrangement, but not with the G7, the major financial powers in the world working together, because it's what we need is some kind of stability and not these great, huge, ups and downs, because that doesn't help anybody. I mean, an occasional person gets a windfall, but it doesn't help anybody. So there has to be, what people need to be looking for is some kind of way to ensure stability, which is very difficult.
Well, we're down toward the end of the show, and it's normally I want to ask you to talk about issues that you see as issues to watch for coming forward. And we've been talking about that all show, so I'll invite you to take up a slightly different charge if you want. You can go with the normal if you'd like, and something that Robert, you suggested. So Robert, I'll put you on the spot first, which is suggested New Year's resolutions for world leaders. What would they be? We only have about a minute left, so Robert.
Invest in the future, invest in a new energy paradigm entirely, but try to think of a global and a national common good rather than simply descending into self-interested competition and greed.
I was thinking in terms of a particular foreign leader, and I was going to suggest that Hugo Chavez of Venezuela should clean up his language, but we would have a lot less entertaining international relations then.
I'm going to take the other road. I spent 5 years in Thailand, and I've been watching with interest the elections there. The Thaksin, who was with the People's Power, has been voted back in. There have been noises in Thailand about the possibility of outlawing the party. I think it's just posturing.
Thank you, John, very much. Thank you, panel, for a great look forward to 2008. Thank you to our viewers, and we'll see you next week on International Focus.